The end of Atlantis did not begin with an army at its gates. It began beneath the ground. In Plato's story, the most powerful island empire the world had ever known vanished in a single terrible stretch of day and night. Earthquakes tore through the land. Floods swallowed cities, harbors, temples, palaces, soldiers, ships, and entire generations disappeared beneath the sea. There was no final victory parade. No last king standing on the walls. Only water. And then silence. For more than 2,000 years, people have searched that silence for answers. Some believe Atlantis lies beneath the Atlantic Ocean, waiting to be found. Others place it under the volcanic ruins of the Aegean, beneath the marshes of Spain, near the coast of Africa, or inside the frozen memory of a world destroyed at the end of the Ice Age. But there is a problem. Every map leads somewhere different. Every discovery seems to create more questions. And the only ancient account that gives Atlantis a name, a history, and a final catastrophe comes from one man. Plato, a philosopher who was not writing a travel guide. He was writing about power, about pride, about the moment a civilization becomes so convinced of its greatness that it can no longer see the disaster approaching. The search for Atlantis is therefore not only a search for a place. It is a search for the boundary between history and warning. And to understand why the legend has survived, we must return to the moment it first entered the written record, not in a sailor's log, not on an Egyptian monument, but inside a conversation written in ancient Athens. Around the middle of the 4th century before Christ, Plato composed 2 dialogues called the Timaeus and the Critias. They were works of philosophy, politics, cosmology, memory, and myth. Inside them, a character named Critias tells a remarkable story. He says the story came to him through his family. According to Critias, the great Athenian statesman Solon had once traveled to Egypt. There, in the city of Sais, Egyptian priests told him that the Greeks had forgotten the deepest parts of their own past. The priests claimed that humanity had been destroyed many times before, sometimes by fire, sometimes by water. Each catastrophe erased knowledge, broke civilizations apart, and forced survivors to begin again. The Greeks remembered only fragments. The Egyptians, protected by the Nile and their temples, claimed to have preserved much older records. Then the priests told Solon about a war that had taken place 9,000 years before his visit. On one side stood an ancient version of Athens, small, disciplined, and virtuous. On the other stood Atlantis, a vast island power from beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the name the Greeks used for the gateway near the Strait of Gibraltar. Atlantis, the priest said, was larger than Libya and Asia together. But those ancient words did not refer to the modern continents as we understand them today. Greek geography used the names differently, and Plato's language has caused confusion for centuries. What mattered was the scale. Atlantis was not described as a forgotten village. It was an empire. Its kings ruled the island itself and other lands beyond it. Its fleets pushed into the Mediterranean. Its armies conquered territory in North Africa and Europe. Then Atlantis attempted something even greater. It tried to dominate the entire known world. One power stood against it: ancient Athens. Plato describes this lost Athens as an ideal state. Its people were brave, ordered, and willing to defend others. When their allies abandoned them, the Athenians continued fighting alone. They defeated Atlantis. But victory did not save either civilization. Soon afterward, violent earthquakes and floods struck. The warriors of Athens were swallowed by the earth. Atlantis sank beneath the sea, and the ocean beyond the Pillars of Hercules became difficult to cross because of the mud left behind by the vanished island. That is the core of the legend. A powerful empire rises. It becomes corrupted. It attacks a smaller, but more virtuous society. It is defeated. Then nature erases almost everything. But Plato did not leave Atlantis as a distant silhouette. In the Critias, he moved closer. He described its gods, its rulers, its geography, its wealth, and the strange design of its capital. And the more detailed the story became, the more real it seemed. According to Plato, when the gods divided the world among themselves, the sea god Poseidon received Atlantis. There he found a mortal woman named Cleito. To protect her, Poseidon enclosed the hill where she lived with alternating rings of land and water. There were 5 pairs of rings surrounding the central island. The design was both beautiful and defensive. No ordinary ship could simply sail into the heart of the kingdom. Poseidon and Cleito had 10 sons, 5 pairs of twins. The eldest was Atlas. He became the first king, and the island and the Atlantic Ocean were said to take their names from him. The other sons ruled different regions, but Atlas held the highest authority. Together, their descendants formed a royal house. At first, Atlantis was presented as a place of almost impossible abundance. The land produced food in every season. Forests supplied timber for ships and buildings. Animals lived across the island, including elephants. Metals could be mined from the earth. One mysterious substance was called orichalcum. Plato described it as highly valued, second only to gold, and said it gleamed with a reddish light. No one knows exactly what he meant. It may have referred to a known metal or alloy. It may have been a literary material meant to make Atlantis feel ancient, wealthy, and strange. But in the imagination of later generations, orichalcum became something more. A lost metal, a symbol of technology the modern world had forgotten. That transformation reveals how the legend works. Plato gives a detail. Centuries of imagination build a world around it. The kings of Atlantis reshaped the island on a massive scale. They bridged the rings of water surrounding the royal center. They cut channels through the land. They created docks, harbors, and passages large enough for ships. A canal connected the outer sea to the inner rings, bringing trade and military power toward the heart of the capital. The city became a machine built around water. Ships passed through controlled entrances. Walls surrounded the rings. Some were covered with brass, others with tin. The innermost wall shone with the red light of orichalcum. At the center stood the sacred island of Poseidon and Cleito. There was a temple to Poseidon, surrounded by gold and decorated with precious materials. Inside stood a great image of the sea god driving a chariot drawn by winged horses. Around him were sea spirits and other figures. The kings gathered there to rule. They did not govern without limits. Plato says Poseidon had given them laws engraved on a pillar of orichalcum. At regular intervals, the rulers met in the temple. They judged disputes. They renewed their loyalty. And they performed a ritual involving a bull. The ceremony was meant to remind them that power did not belong to any one king alone. They were bound by law, tradition, and divine order. This is important because Atlantis did not begin as an evil civilization. In Plato's telling, its first rulers were wise. They valued virtue more than wealth. They controlled their desires. They understood that prosperity could disappear. For generations, the divine part of their nature remained strong. They possessed enormous riches, but riches did not possess them. Then something changed. The descendants of Poseidon became increasingly human. The divine element within them weakened. Gold, territory, status, and conquest became more important. What had once been enough no longer satisfied them. Atlantis did not collapse because it lacked resources. It collapsed because abundance created appetite. The island had walls, canals, armies, fleets, and wealth beyond measure. But it lost the one defense no empire can build from stone: restraint. This is the point where the legend becomes more than a story about a sunken island. Plato had watched his own city suffer from ambition, war, political violence, and defeat. Athens had once led a powerful maritime alliance. Over time, that alliance became an empire. Tribute flowed into the city. Athenian fleets controlled the sea. Its citizens praised democracy, art, philosophy, and freedom. But Athens also forced weaker communities to obey. When the island of Melos resisted Athenian demands during the Peloponnesian War, the Athenians killed the adult men and enslaved the women and children. Power had changed the city. Athens eventually lost the war against Sparta. Its walls were torn down. Its fleet was reduced. Political terror followed. Plato had also seen his teacher Socrates condemned and executed by the Athenian state. He knew that a society could call itself wise while acting blindly. He knew that democracy could produce injustice. He knew that victory could become arrogance, and arrogance could become ruin. Against that background, Atlantis begins to look less like a coded map and more like a mirror. A maritime empire. Rich, confident, expanding, and certain that its greatness gives it the right to rule others. The image would have been familiar to Plato's audience. But Plato did not simply recreate the Athens of his own time. He reversed the roles. In the Atlantis story, Ancient Athens is the disciplined defender. Atlantis is the aggressive empire. The comparison forces the listener to ask an uncomfortable question. Was Plato praising an imaginary Athens because the real Athens had failed to live up to that ideal? If so, Atlantis was not just an enemy destroyed by the gods. It was a warning written for the people sitting closest to Plato. And just when the story reaches the moment of judgment, something strange happens. The Critias stops. Not after the destruction. Before it. The final surviving lines describe Zeus looking down upon Atlantis. He sees that the people have become corrupted. He decides to punish them so they may become more moderate. The gods gather. Zeus prepares to speak. And then the text breaks off. The sentence never arrives. The war is not fully narrated. The catastrophe is not described in detail. The complete ending of Atlantis is missing. Perhaps Plato died before finishing the dialogue. Perhaps part of the manuscript was lost. Perhaps he deliberately ended at the moment before judgment. No one knows. But the silence helped make the legend immortal. A complete story can be closed. An unfinished story invites every generation to continue it. For centuries, readers have tried. Yet before we search beneath oceans and deserts, one fact must remain clear. No surviving Egyptian text tells the Atlantis story as Plato tells it. No earlier Greek source gives the same account. Herodotus wrote about Egypt before Plato, but he did not record Atlantis. Ancient historians described wars, kingdoms, floods, islands, and vanished peoples. None provides independent confirmation of Plato's empire. The trail begins with Plato. Every later version follows him. That does not prove that every element was invented from nothing. Stories can preserve distorted memories. Real disasters can become myths. Names can change. Dates can grow larger through retelling. But without another ancient source, the evidence for Atlantis as a historical empire remains extremely weak. And yet the ancient world knew that cities could disappear. The earth beneath the Mediterranean was unstable. Earthquakes shattered walls. Tsunamis struck coastlines. Volcanoes destroyed settlements. Harbors sank. Entire communities were abandoned. To Plato's audience, the sudden destruction of a city by nature was not impossible. It had happened before. One example lay in Greece itself. The city of Helike stood near the Gulf of Corinth. In 373 before Christ, during Plato's lifetime, an earthquake and a powerful flood destroyed it. Ancient writers later described the city as submerged. For generations, people said fishermen could see ruins beneath the water. Helike was not Atlantis. It was smaller, closer, and destroyed thousands of years later than Plato's date. But its fate shows how a real disaster could shape the imagination of someone writing about a civilization swallowed in a single night. There was also a much older catastrophe. Around the second millennium before Christ, the volcanic island of Thera, now called Santorini, experienced one of the most powerful eruptions in human history. The eruption buried settlements under ash. It shattered part of the island. It sent destructive waves across the Aegean. On Thera, the town now known as Akrotiri was preserved beneath volcanic material. Its buildings, paintings, storage rooms, and streets reveal a sophisticated Bronze Age society connected to the Minoan world of Crete. The Minoans were skilled sailors and traders. They built palaces. They created art filled with marine life, ceremonies, and landscapes. Their civilization was wealthy and deeply connected to the sea. The similarities are tempting. A prosperous island culture, advanced seafaring, a devastating natural disaster, a civilization remembered through ruins. For many people, Santorini seems like the strongest historical inspiration for Atlantis. But the differences are just as important. Thera lies inside the Mediterranean, not beyond the Pillars of Hercules. The eruption occurred more than 1,000 years before Plato, not 9,000 years before Solon. The Minoans were not instantly erased. Their civilization continued after the eruption, though the disaster may have weakened networks and contributed to later changes. And there is no evidence that the people of Thera called themselves Atlanteans or ruled the empire Plato described. Santorini may have contributed images to the story. It is not a perfect match. That pattern repeats with nearly every proposed location. Each theory explains one part of Plato's account. Then another part refuses to fit. Spain has long attracted Atlantis hunters because it lies near the Pillars of Hercules, southwest of modern Seville. The wetlands around Diana preserve signs of ancient landscapes shaped by rivers, the sea, storms, and human settlement. The region was connected to Tartessos, a wealthy culture known to Greek and Phoenician writers. Tartessos traded in metals. It existed at the western edge of the Mediterranean world. Its identity and disappearance became mysterious in later memory. Some researchers and television documentaries have proposed that a settlement destroyed by a tsunami in southern Spain inspired Atlantis. The location beyond or near the pillars seems promising. The danger of coastal flooding is real. Ancient communities did live in the region, but no discovery has revealed Plato's ringed capital, his 10 kings, or a lost empire matching the story. Geological damage is not proof of Atlantis. Almost every ancient coastline contains evidence of storms, earthquakes, changing sea levels, or abandoned settlements. To identify Atlantis, a theory must do more than find a ruined place near water. It must explain why Plato's unique combination of geography, politics, religion, chronology, and moral purpose belongs there. Atlantic islands such as the Azores, the Canaries, and Madeira have also been proposed. Their volcanic peaks look like survivors of a drowned world. But geology does not support the idea that a continent-sized island sank there during human history. The same problem appears near Bimini in the Bahamas, where naturally fractured beach rock has been called an Atlantean road. The formations are real. The lost civilization is an interpretation. No inscriptions, tools, or unmistakable ruins connect them to Plato's empire. Later writers tried to use Atlantis to explain the civilizations of the Americas and Egypt. They claimed Atlantean refugees taught people to build pyramids, practice astronomy, or work metal. But archaeology shows long local developments created those achievements. The Maya, Mexica, Inca, Egyptians, and many other peoples did not require a lost master civilization. Giving their accomplishments to Atlantis does not solve history. It erases the people who actually made it. This became even more powerful after the publication of a book in 1882. Its author was Ignatius Donnelly, an American politician and writer. The Antediluvian World. Donnelly argued that Atlantis was the original source of many later cultures. He connected pyramids, flood legends, religion, writing, and metalworking to one lost mother civilization. The book transformed Plato's political warning into a global theory of history. But similarity does not prove contact. Different societies can independently create monuments, boats, solar symbols, and flood stories. Donnelly ignored chronology and context, yet his promise was irresistible. Find Atlantis, and every ancient mystery would suddenly make sense. From that point on, Atlantis grew far beyond Plato. Occult writers gave its people supernatural powers. Later stories added crystals, flying machines, energy weapons, and secret colonies. None of this appears in Plato. His Atlantis had ships, canals, temples, agriculture, cavalry, and metalworking. It was impressive by ancient standards, not a science fiction civilization. The myth also entered darker territory when racial theorists used it to invent a superior ancestral people. Such claims had no foundation in archaeology. Atlantis could inspire wonder, but it could also be used to erase real cultures and give prejudice the appearance of ancient authority. Whenever a submerged structure or coastal ruin is discovered, the word Atlantis appears. The name guarantees attention, but archaeology requires more than resemblance. Dates must be tested. Structures must show human construction. Objects and inscriptions must come from clear contexts. Atlantis claims often reverse that process. First comes the conclusion. Then every stone is forced to support it. One modern theory places Atlantis in the Rikat structure of Mauritania, sometimes called the Eye of the Sahara. Seen from above, the geological formation contains enormous circular rings. Its shape has been compared to Plato's concentric city. The surrounding landscape includes mountains, plains, and evidence that water once moved through the region. Online videos have attracted millions of viewers by presenting it as the remains of Atlantis. The image is striking, but the Rikat structure is a natural geological formation, vastly larger than Plato's capital and located far inland today. There is no accepted archaeological evidence of the maritime empire Plato described. The rings are real. The identification is speculation. Other theories place Atlantis beneath Antarctica or in still more remote locations. They remain attractive for one reason. Mystery survives best where evidence is hardest to reach. The deep ocean has the same power. Much of it remains remote, and ancient coastlines do lie beneath modern seas. At the end of the last ice age, global sea levels rose dramatically as ice sheets melted. Land once occupied by humans was flooded. Between Britain and continental Europe, a vast lowland known today as Doggerland disappeared beneath the North Sea. In Southeast Asia, large areas of the Sunda Shelf were submerged. Around the world, shorelines moved inland. Communities lost hunting grounds, settlements, and sacred places. Memories of rising water may have survived in oral traditions. This is genuine lost land. But it is not automatically Atlantis. Plato described an organized empire with monumental architecture, kings, armies, and a specific war against Athens. The societies living on many flooded Ice Age landscapes were very different. The reality of prehistoric inundation proves that lands can vanish. It does not prove Plato's island existed exactly as written. Still, the end of the Ice Age raises an important possibility. Could very old memories survive for thousands of years? Oral traditions can preserve information longer than once assumed. Some indigenous stories appear to describe coastlines and volcanic events that occurred many generations ago. But stories also change. Names move. Moral lessons are added. Separate events merge. Numbers expand. A memory may remain while almost every detail around it transforms. If Atlantis contains a historical echo, it may not point to one city. It may combine many fears. The destruction of Helike, the eruption of Thera, memories of tsunamis, the fall of Bronze Age kingdoms, the rise and defeat of empires, the political failures of Athens, the ancient belief that civilization moves in cycles of growth and destruction. Plato may have taken the emotional truth of real disasters and built a fictional empire powerful enough to carry his philosophical warning. That possibility explains why the story feels historical even when evidence for the place is missing. It is built from things that happen. Cities do fall. Seas do rise. Empires do become arrogant. People do ignore warnings. Wealth does weaken restraint. And nature does not care how permanent a civilization believes itself to be. The most famous lost city in history may therefore be made from the ruins of many real cities. Yet there is another mystery. Why did Plato choose Egypt as the source of the story? To the Greeks, Egypt represented antiquity. Its temples, monuments, and priesthood seemed to preserve knowledge from a world older than Greece. By placing Atlantis inside an Egyptian record, Plato gave the story authority. He also created distance. The tale was not presented as something Critias invented yesterday. It traveled across centuries. An Egyptian priest told Solon. Solon brought it to Greece. It passed through a family. Then Critias spoke it before Socrates. Each step made the story feel inherited. But each step also made verification impossible. The chain of transmission is part of the drama. The listener is asked to trust a memory of a translation of a priestly account. Plato understood storytelling. He knew that a distant source could make a fictional narrative feel ancient. Modern audiences use the same technique. A story becomes more powerful when it begins with a hidden manuscript, a dying witness, a forbidden archive, or knowledge preserved by a secret order. The source is always close enough to fascinate us and far enough to escape examination. Plato's characters even discuss whether the story is true. Critias insists that it is. But characters inside a dialogue are not independent witnesses. Plato created the conversation. He controlled every voice. A novelist can make a character swear that an event truly happened. The oath does not transform fiction into archaeology. This does not mean Plato was lying. Ancient philosophical myths were not lies in the simple sense. They were instruments. They could express truths about justice, the soul, politics, nature, and human weakness through stories. Plato often used myths when argument alone was not enough. Atlantis may have been designed to test his ideal state against a powerful enemy. Could a virtuous society survive contact with overwhelming wealth and military force? Could discipline defeat empire? What happens when rulers lose the character that once made their laws meaningful? These questions mattered more to Plato than the coordinates of the island. That may explain why the geography is both detailed and impossible to settle. The city is specific enough to visualize. The wider world is distant enough to remain symbolic, and the final destruction is absolute enough to prevent survivors from returning with proof. Atlantis exists in the perfect location for a legend, just beyond the edge of certainty. But suppose, for a moment, that explorers discovered something extraordinary tomorrow. Imagine sonar revealing a massive ancient settlement beneath the Atlantic. Imagine divers finding walls, docks, human-made canals, tools, inscriptions, and materials dating to a period no known civilization could explain. Would that prove Atlantis? Not immediately. The site would need to be studied. Its language would need to be understood. Its age and culture would need to match specific parts of Plato's account. Even then, the discovery might reveal that Plato transformed a real place into something very different. History rarely returns exactly as legend remembers it. Troy offers a useful comparison. For centuries, many readers treated the city of Homer's Iliad as purely mythical. Archaeology later revealed layers of ancient settlement at Hizarlik in modern Turkey, including cities destroyed by war and disaster. But the discovery did not prove every event, speech, hero, and divine intervention in the Iliad happened exactly as the poem describes. A real city can stand behind an epic without making the epic a literal report. Atlantis could someday follow that pattern. A real disaster might stand behind the story, but no accepted discovery has yet crossed that line. Until it does, the responsible conclusion remains simple. Plato's Atlantis is first a philosophical legend. It may contain echoes of real places and disasters, but the empire itself has not been found. For believers, that answer feels unsatisfying. They argue that the oceans are vast and that absence of evidence is not always evidence of absence. That is true for a small shipwreck or settlement. But a vast empire should leave trade goods, borrowed words, weapons, ceramics, inscriptions, or memories among neighboring peoples. The greater Atlantis becomes, the harder it is for every footprint to vanish except a story written thousands of years later. This is the contradiction at the center of the search. To explain the lack of evidence, Atlantis must be made smaller. But to match the legend, it must remain enormous. The mystery survives between those two needs. And perhaps that is why people continue searching. Atlantis is not merely lost. It represents everything we fear history has taken from us. Unknown languages, forgotten inventions, libraries destroyed before their ideas could spread, cities buried by sand, ships carrying stories that never reached shore, entire peoples known only from the names their enemies gave them. The ancient world is full of silence. Most voices did not survive. Most buildings collapsed. Most would decayed. Most ordinary lives left no written record. Atlantis gives all that absence a single shape. A city underwater. A civilization visible only in imagination. When people search for Atlantis, they are also asking how much of the human story is gone forever. The answer is uncomfortable. A great deal. Archaeology has recovered extraordinary worlds. But the surviving record is only a fraction of what once existed. That truth makes Atlantis feel possible. Not because the evidence confirms Plato, because history has taught us that forgetting is powerful. Yet Plato's warning does not depend on the island being real. That may be the most important part of the story. Atlantis possessed everything people usually believe will make a civilization safe. Natural resources, fertile land, strong defenses, advanced engineering, religious traditions, written laws, a powerful military, control of trade. It was protected by rings of water and walls of metal. But none of these could protect it from corruption within. The kings still had the law of Poseidon engraved in the temple. They still performed the rituals. They still inherited the titles. The outer structure remained. The inner meaning disappeared. This is how civilizations often decay. Not by suddenly forgetting every rule. By keeping the rules while abandoning the purpose behind them. Institutions remain standing. Ceremonies continue. Leaders speak the old language of duty. But ambition has replaced service. Appearance has replaced virtue. Expansion has replaced stability. By the time the crisis becomes visible, the collapse may already be moving beneath the surface. That is why Atlantis begins with abundance and ends with appetite. The island is not punished for being wealthy. It is punished because wealth becomes the measure of all things. Its rulers stop seeing limits. They look beyond their own prosperous world and decide that the lands of others should also belong to them. The war against ancient Athens is therefore not a random battle. It is the final symptom. Atlantis must conquer because it no longer knows how to be satisfied. And in Plato's universe, the loss of self-control is the beginning of destruction. The enemy is defeated by Athens. The island is destroyed by nature. But the true collapse happened earlier. It happened when the Atlanteans became unable to govern themselves. More than 2,000 years later, the warning remains. Every powerful society believes it is different from the empires that fell before it. But the ruins of history were once modern. Their palaces held officials, their roads carried armies, and their harbors received ships from distant lands. Atlantis compresses that truth into one image. The sea closes over the city. The surface becomes calm. Future generations argue over whether the civilization existed at all. That may be the deepest terror in the story. Not death, erasure. The possibility that a society can build for centuries and disappear so completely that its achievements become rumors. Its kings become symbols. Its disasters become entertainment. Its warnings become mysteries. And the people who once believed themselves to be at the center of the world become a question. Was Atlantis real? The honest answer is that no one has found the empire Plato described. No excavation has produced its capital. No inscription has named its kings. No independent ancient archive confirms its war with Athens. Most scholars understand the story as a philosophical creation, possibly shaped by real disasters and political experience. But that answer does not kill Atlantis. It reveals why Atlantis matters. A real city can be located on a map. A warning can appear anywhere. Atlantis may be Thera when a prosperous island underestimates nature. It may be Athens when democracy becomes empire. It may be Helike when the earth destroys a city in a single night. It may be every nation that mistakes wealth for wisdom. Every ruler who confuses power with virtue. Every generation that believes the laws of history apply only to the dead. Plato placed Atlantis beyond the Pillars of Hercules, at the edge of the known world. But the true island was never safely distant. It was always close. It was built inside human ambition. That is why explorers have crossed oceans to find it. That is why writers keep rebuilding it. That is why every few years someone announces that the mystery has finally been solved. They search beneath the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, the Sahara, the ice, and the marshes of Spain. But perhaps Plato's final trick was to make us look outward, to send us toward the horizon, to make us search for walls, canals, and temples while the real evidence stands around us. Civilizations rise. They become powerful. They call their power permanent. Then they face the question Atlantis could not answer. Can greatness survive without restraint? Plato never completed Zeus's final speech. We do not know what the god intended to say before the surviving text fell silent. But the destruction had already been announced. The lesson did not need another sentence. Atlantis had conquered seas, mastered stone, gathered gold, and built walls that shone like fire. It could control ships, armies, canals, and kingdoms. It could not control its own hunger. And by the time the people of Atlantis understood what their power had cost them, the ground was already breaking beneath their feet. The sea did not destroy a perfect civilization. It buried the ruins of one that had already lost itself. Maybe Atlantis is still waiting beneath the waves. Maybe its stones will one day rise from the darkness. Or maybe the island was never meant to be found. Because the complete story of Atlantis is not the story of where a civilization disappeared. It is the story of how. And the most frightening part is that humanity has repeated it ever since.